Wake that ass up.
Early in the morning.
The Breakfast Club.
Here we go. Morning, everybody. It's DJ Envy, Angela Yee, Charlamagne the Guy. We are the Breakfast Club. Now we got a special guest on the line right now. We have Reverend Dr. William. Oh, hold on.
Barber, there you go. You got it.
My thing come on. Okay. We have Reverend Dr. William Barber. Good morning, brother.
Good morning. Good morning.
All right, we can hear you clearly now. Now, I was saying a second ago that you and Charlamagne were talking behind the scenes when we were setting everything up, and we said save it for air. So, Charlamagne, what were you talking about with the brother?
Well, he was telling me about how when he goes to meetings with these politicians and he asks for things. Go ahead, Reverend Barber.
Yeah, the bottom line is, in our campaign, the Poor People's Campaign, the National Call for Moral Revival, we did an audit of America on 5 interlocking injustices, 5 injustices that are like interlocking evils, and you got to address all of them simultaneously because they try to choke the life out of what's left of this democracy. Systemic racism in all of its forms, systemic poverty, ecological devastation, denial of health care, the war economy and militarism, and the false moral narrative of religious nationalism and white evangelicalism. When you go into meetings and you start talking and you lay out an agenda, you actually have 50 things or 20 things that relate to that, how we deal with it. The question is always, well, what is the most important? Or what one thing? Or for instance, on race, they'll say, okay, well, we got a commission that we're gonna do on racism. And what we say is, we have an agenda here. And then after a while, I finally say, listen, look at this pandemic. We passed 3 bills, $3 trillion in less than 40 days, back in 2 weeks. The corporations get everything they want. They get $3 trillion. So if they can get 3 trillion things, then you need to hear my 50, right? We're not playing that game because politics is not just about listening. So I mean, one of the things that I'm deeply concerned about right now, I heard it this morning, somebody say, well, you know, Trump this and Trump this, but you know, we were getting along before him. I'm saying, but getting along doing what?
That's right. Getting
along doing what? There were 140 million poor people in this country prior to the pandemic. 43% of this nation and 61% of African Americans were poor and low income prior to this pandemic. And 700 people were dying a day and 250,000 a year. 7 people died from vaping, and we had a congressional hearing. 7 people died from vaping, and there was a presidential audience in the White House. 700 people dying a day from poverty, and 61% of African Americans poor and low wealth, 68% of Latino, and politicians are scared to say poverty. Republicans racialize it, Democrats run from it, nobody deals with the reality of it. So we're not gonna just talk about one thing. Right. We need to talk about the comprehensive things that need to be done.
Absolutely.
Let me ask you a question, Reverend Barber. Why haven't Black people received the economic justice they deserve from this country?
You know, it has a long history. I don't want to go through the whole history. You know it as well as I do. You know, even after slavery, you know, the thing that they stopped real quick was the 40 acres and the mule. It's kind of like, y'all free, and pause. And people, but our fight that got out of slavery wasn't just, the 2 things we weren't fighting for: a long weekend, you know, we get out 3 days and go 4 days, get extra day and then go back for 4 days. And the other thing we weren't fighting for was just freedom. It was citizenship, full citizenship. I think the problem is, one, we've not dealt with the extent of the problem. That's the first thing. Since King's killed, Robert Kennedy was killed in 1968, for about 52 years, if you think about it, the issue of poverty has been wiped off the table. We have both parties are trapped, not in the same way, but by a neoliberalism imagination that basically says, one group says, if you take care of the middle class and up, everybody else will be okay. If you take care, well, others says if you take care of the top, it'll trickle down. Well, that's just not true. And so when you're trapped in that imagination and you're not even talking about the extent of the economic injustice, I want your audience to hear that piece. When I say 140 million people, that ought to shock everybody. First of all, the government says there's only 38, 39 million people that are poor. That's not true. According to Columbia, Harvard, it's 140 million. Now, if you don't ever deal with the extent of the problem or you marginalize the problem, then your policies are not going to represent. I've said to, in the Poor People's Campaign, we say it to the Black Caucus, the Latino Caucus, the Progressive Caucus. We'll say it to anybody, Republicans and Democrats. You cannot continue to pass policies year after year after year and say we're getting better a little bit and never deal with the fact that 43% of your entire population in poverty. And in this pandemic, it's going over 50. It's going over 50%. So you first have to deal with the extent of the issue.
So what do you think the solution should be? How do we solve this problem?
Right. Well, again, if I might talk in the terms that I talk in terms of fusion, moral fusion analysis, there are several things that block us from dealing with the real economic agenda. One starts with racism, one form of racism, and that's racist voter suppression and gerrymandering, because that's used to lock up the system in a certain way so that people can't really break through and be engaged. What I mean by that, we do mapping in our movement. And every state that is a racist voter suppression state, that's where the governor, the legislature, the congressional representatives, the Senate, and the presidential candidates get elected, is skewed by gerrymandering and racism. Okay, that's a fact of the matter. The courts recently called it surgical racism. So that means that your political bodies are not really representative of the people. You can actually have more people vote in a progressive way, but then they not get elected because of racism. Now you say, well, what does that have to do with economics? Well, economics is fostered by policy, not just by charity, and not just by one or two people getting rich. It's policy. 54% of all African Americans, for instance, make less than a living wage. You could change that tomorrow by raising the minimum wage to $15 an hour and pump $638 billion into the economy. But you can't raise that just by asking corporations to be nice. It has to be a policy. Voter suppression undermines our politics. Let me quickly show you what I mean by that. Mm-hmm. Every state that is a racist voter suppression state, if you put the map over there, is also a high poverty state, is also a state where the politicians block living wages and block health care. And the people who are doing that, many of them get elected, not because they won the vote, but because they cheated through racist voter suppression and gerrymandering. So and here's the other piece of that. The people who use race to get elected, once they get elected, they not only pass policies that hurt the overwhelming number of Black people, they pass policies that hurt white people, because there are more white people that are poor in raw numbers than there are Black people. There are more Black people that are impacted by poverty in terms of the percentage, but there are actually more white people in raw numbers. So if your politics is locked up, then your policies are locked up. And what kind of policies do we need? We need living wages.
That's right.
Immediately. We need guaranteed basic income. Dr. King talked about that years ago.
That's right.
We need health care. 80 million people in this country without health care or underinsured in the richest nation in the world. There are 25 other countries that are considered the richest countries in this world. We're the only one of the 25 that connects health care to your job and not to your body and your humanity. And we're going to have 13 million more people added in the midst of this pandemic, the projections say. And every congressperson gets free health care. Every governor gets free health care. But when it comes to the people having the same thing they have, all of a sudden we can't afford it. Healthcare undermines economic prosperity. We need to have investments in empowerment zones where there's been not just 20 years of poverty, where poverty is, investment in those areas to draw in businesses, to draw in development in those areas. We have to deal with ecological devastation because it's killing Black people. Go down to Cancer Alley in Louisiana. St. Parish County had the highest per capita rate of death before COVID. That's right in the middle of Cancer Alley, where they said they were bringing all of those businesses and would create business. It didn't create business, it created cancer, created death. Then you can't deal with grades our economic prosperity if you don't deal with the war economy. Right now, we spend 53 cents of every discretionary dollar into the war economy. That's $850 billion. That's more money. That's more money than China, Russia, North Korea, Iran, and Iraq combined. Just one contract from Boeing could fund all of the states that denied Medicaid expansion under the Affordable Care Act. Just one contract, man. So you got to, Dr. King said, any country whose decisions politically are being made primarily by how you fund the military and fund the greed, what Eisenhower called the Congressional Industrial Military Complex, is a country headed towards spiritual death. So Dr. DJ Envy, the thing about it is it has to be a comprehensive analysis because one thing tricks into the other. For instance, let me give you some numbers. 54% of African Americans make less than living wage. That means people who are working every day, but still some of them have to live in their cars. There's not a county in this country where you can work a minimum wage job and afford a basic 2-bedroom house. Not one county. There's 4 million people that get up every morning in this country who can buy unleaded gas and can't buy unleaded water.
Wow.
So we have to have a comprehensive restructuring and challenging of the injustices. And it's a fight. It's not just folk saying, well, I'm a Republican, you're a Democrat, let's shake hands and go to dinner and we're getting along. That's not what politics is about, getting along. Politics is about changing policies. And we know some things. If you expanded Medicaid in the 14 states that did not expand it, and all of them are primarily in the South, they're the same state. It's interesting, Charlamagne, the same governors that was trying to rush our people to go back to work without the protections are the same governors that supported racist, voter suppression, and blocked health care. Same governor. Now, how is it that you're going to say, go back to work, but we're not going to, at least expand health care? We know right now that if we had expanded health care, it would have put jobs. That's the other thing. If you expand health care, it creates jobs. A healthy economy is a more wealthy economy. So it's comprehensive. And what we've done in the Poor People's Campaign, this is what we did. We did an audit called The Souls of Poor Folk, Auditing America 50 years after the original Poor People's Campaign. We looked at those 5 areas, and then we did a budget. I couldn't go through the whole budget in the time we have, but we did something called the Moral Justice Budget, and we found out 2 things. The lie of scarcity is a lie. Joseph Stiglitz, who's a Nobel Peace Prize economist, wrote a book called The Cost of Inequality. The cost of, not the cost to fix it, but what's the cost of leaving it as it is? We know that the lie of scarcity is a lie. The money is in fact there. And we know that if we invest in closing the gap, closing poverty, and closing down low-wage jobs, it actually benefits the whole society. You ask me, why don't we have that? The will. Because both parties 2 times, we had 30-some presidential debates since 2016. Think with me. When did you hear one of those debates on poverty? Democrat or Republican?
None.
143 million people now, 140 million people in poverty, black and white, 66 million white people, 61% of black people. Majority of, 1/3 of all poor people in the South, 1/3 of all poor white people are in the South. Not one debate, presidential, was on poverty. We have less voting rights today than we had August 6, 1965, because the Voting Rights Act was gutted in 2013. And McConnell has held it up for over 2,000 days, going on 3,000 days. Could have been fixed on June 26, 2013, after the Supreme Court gutted it on June 25th. Think about that. We have less voting rights because of the gutting of the Section 5 of the Voting Rights Act. There was not 1 hour debate on just those two things.
Reverend Barber, can I ask you a question?
Yes, yes.
So with everything that's been happening now with the pandemic, with coronavirus, do you feel like people are becoming more active and that they're actually stepping up and saying what the demands are? And right before an election, just wanting certain policies and being more involved in local elections and all of that? Do you think that things are about to be somewhat of a revolution?
Yeah, I think that those who think that the reaction to George Floyd's murder, lynching, knee killing on camera, death by racism, that's what we saw. I call it a Code 66, death by racism. But you miss it if you think it's just about George Floyd. The same way you would miss it if you thought the reaction to the killing of Jimmy Lee Jackson, a cop in 1965, was just about Jimmy Lee Jackson. We are seeing public mourning. People are protesting because they know it doesn't have to be like this. People only protest what they believe can be changed. If folk didn't protest, that meant we really would be in trouble, because it would mean people have given up all hope that things could change. Now, I think that this we see happening has the potential for people to say, wait a minute, when he said, "I can't breathe," he was talking about that cop's knee on his neck and those other cops on his back. But I think a lot of people heard that metaphorically. We can't breathe either.
That's right.
Because of the weight of poverty on our necks and the denial of healthcare on our necks. You see, we're in the midst, it's when this happened. It happened in the midst of a pandemic. Prior to the pandemic, you had 140 million people poor, 700 people a day dying from poverty. Then you have the pandemic. We have all this negligence and ineptitude of the president and the Senate. And then we have all this money. 3 bills get passed, it goes to the corporate, goes up, it doesn't come down. And then we take service workers and we say, oh, we know what we'll do. We'll give them a name change. That's all they need. Changing from service worker to essential workers, but we won't give them the essentials they need. So you had 3 bills passed. Not one of those bills guaranteed health care in the middle of a pandemic. We didn't shift. Not one of those bills said we're going to guarantee sick leave. We're going to guarantee unemployment. We're going to guarantee rent forgiveness. The actual bill that they passed said you could have a moratorium on your rent for 3 years, 3 months, but in the 4th month, you had to pay the 3 months and the 4th month at the same month. Well, you couldn't pay 1 month at a time. How the hell you supposed to do?
Absolutely.
You know, really, I mean, really. And we didn't even guarantee in those bills utilities could be cut off. So in a pandemic where you need to wash your hands, there was nothing in there that said you can't cut off people's water.
Dang.
Right, but like you said, you know, I was talking the other day, I was like, you know, you say deferment, I ain't got to pay for 3 months, right? Let's say 4 months, let's say. Then I got to get and find a job. Then when I find a job, you want me to pay the full 4 months right away?
Right.
I can't afford it. Or
and you did.
On the bill, you can't, how could you, if I couldn't pay, if I could barely pay $1,300, now you're going to raise my note up so I can make up the 4 months?
Right.
Now I can't pay that. I'm going to be late and you're going to evict.
That's right. But you immediately give the corporations $2-3 trillion. 85% of all that money went up top. 85%. Mm-hmm. So basically you say to them, we're going to pay you to pay your bill. In fact, we're going to say poor folk have to pay an 85% surcharge just to get a little teeny bit. We didn't, you know, nobody would look, probably my Breakfast Club, you wouldn't go to a club that had an 85% surcharge on you just coming in. Come on, y'all. I mean, we ain't all been saved all our life. Come on here.
Hey, Reverend Barber, I keep saying that if Barack Obama is JFK, Joe Biden has the chance to be Lyndon B. Johnson, especially in a moment like this. Do you think he could be as progressive on race and class as LBJ?
Well, let me, and I'm gonna answer that by finishing that point and come right to it. Mm-hmm. So we have 100,000 people die. And then we find out 60, 70% of them didn't have to die. Think about where we are. Mm-hmm. We're already dying, poor folk dying, people for lack of health care. Every 500,000 people, 2,800 people die. for every 500,000 people that don't have health care, 2,800 people die. And then we see this lynching. It didn't just happen. A 17-year-old girl stood before Goliath, the Goliath of racism and murder, and kept her phone. And we got to see it from start to finish. And when that happened, it shocked folk, and they said, the systems are failing. This guy, in our name, in the name of the state, murdered this guy in front of us, but it's not just George Floyd and all the other, we hear the echoes of Eric Garner, but people, we're in a season of dying. Mm-hmm. Right? Now, can Biden be LBJ, or can he be Franklin Delano Roosevelt? Or I think we are in a third Reconstruction, the pains of a third Reconstruction. The first one was Reconstruction right after slavery. Mm-hmm. Then you had a reaction to that, just like Trump was a reaction to Barack Obama. We had a second Reconstruction, the Civil Rights Movement. Then the reaction to that was the Southern strategy and Wallace and Nixon and all that. And now we're in the birth pains of a third Reconstruction. I said to Vice President on an Easter podcast,
I heard it.
All right, that there are moments that crucifixion gives you an opportunity to resurrect, mm-hmm. but you got to take it. There are moments that what you may have said and meant well before doesn't fit. And you have to know that moment. And not only Biden, but the Congress. I keep saying to even to Democrats, all this energy in the streets, what if people, you come out, they come out with a hero's bill, but even that's limited. Because it's limited, they say, well, what we can't get passed because of McConnell. Well, why not pass in the House what ought to be passed? And then if McConnell wants to go against people's lives, let him do that publicly. And we film that and show it to people. And then the question becomes, do you want to vote for folk who are trying to fight for you to have health care? Or do you want to vote for folk that even in the midst of a pandemic will let you die? Do you want to vote for people who will say you need a living wage and will push that out there? Or do you want to vote for people that believe in things that really need to live are corporations? There has to be a dichotomy. And we have to get free of this neoliberal from the middle up imagination. So I think it's possible, but it's only possible if it's rooted in policy.
That's right.
Can't just be conversation. And this is the time I think you have to do a major presentation. In fact, this is gonna sound strange, maybe to some folks. And let me say it here. I keep hearing folks saying we need a Black agenda, but the question is, how do we do that? And what I mean by that, if you look at these 5 interlocking injustices, what I'm looking for, and what the Poor People's Campaign is looking for, and why we're meeting on June 20th, 2020 for a mass Poor People's Assembly and Moral March on Washington. We were gonna do it on Pennsylvania Avenue. Now it's gonna be on digital. And we've been sent out 50 million invitations, and we have 45 state coordinating committees and 16 denominations and 100 partners. But that day, you're not gonna hear from me, or say, you're gonna hear from this white coal miner in Kentucky who's hooking up with these Black folk from the Mississippi Delta who've decided to address racism and poverty. Not just poverty so we don't have to deal with race, and not just race so they think that's just dealing with Black people. What if we had the Congress and the candidates, forget party for a minute, and I said to Vice President Biden, the year for statesmen, like you said, LBJ, what if you say, here's my plan for healthcare. Let's just say healthcare, this is a pandemic. And when I put this plan together, I made sure that addressing the disparities of race was right in the center of putting it together. I made sure that addressing the disparities of rural America was right in the center of it. Now here's the plan. And if I am elected and this plan is pushed forward, this is how it will impact Black people. This is how it will impact Latino people. This is how it will impact children. This is how, that's the grown-up conversation.
Right, absolutely.
We got to have.
Absolutely.
In America. It's not even about getting a plan and going over here with a few Black folk in a room. It's about saying in every aspect, I want to know what your plan is in banking. and how that's going to impact Black people. I want to know what your plan is in the defense industry and how that's going to affect poor people and Black people and brown people. I want in every piece of policy, our campaign says, in every policy, we want to know how does it address systemic racism, systemic poverty, ecological devastation, so forth and so on. So those, and then that way, we move from voting for a person to a person that has a policy.
That's right.
But you also have to have the Congress do the same thing. The Congress can't block a LBJ or Franklin Delano Roosevelt type. You can't get elected with all of this fervor. And then after you get elected, say, now y'all go home and be quiet because we got to do politics like we need to do. And we got to shake hands and we got to be nice and we got to take people out to dinner. That's not why you're elected.
That's right.
That's not, you're elected to do righteous battle. You don't have to kill nobody, but you're elected to do, but you can't get elected. And somebody, I remember I was in front of a congressional hearing, and Mark Meadows, who's now the president's chief of staff, was bragging about how he loved a congressman that just died from Baltimore. And
I can't remember his name. Oh, man. God damn it.
Helped my mind early this morning.
I got it.
Jesus. It'll come back in a minute. But he was bragging about how they were great friends. Mm-hmm. So when it was my time to talk, I said, I wish Congressman Meadows, you all had the friendship where you would have been with him on economic injustice.
Elijah Cummings, rest in peace.
Elijah Cummings. I wish you would have been with him on healthcare, because I don't understand this kind of friendship. And that's not something you ought to brag about in politics. You ought not brag, well, we just can shake hands and get along. But if getting along doesn't address the issue of 140 million people in poverty, doesn't address systemic racism. You know what Coretta Scott King said? Not Dr. King, Coretta said. When they asked her about violence one time, because her husband had been shot, murdered, she said, let me tell you about violence. Violence is denying a child education. I'm talking about violence. Violence is denying health care. Violence is denying people wages and union rights. Violence is undermining a culture. And then she said, and there's another form of violence, and that is an apathetic attitude that refuses to address the other forms of violence, is itself a sinister form of violence.
You said systemic racism is choking the life out of American democracy. So how do we dismantle the system of systemic racism?
Yeah, well, racism, and I'm glad you said that, systemic racism, because first of all, we have to understand that racism is not a spectacle. That's the first thing. We have to stop seeing racism as just being a spectacle. So you have a whole lot of people right now, and I love them, but the truth is, they are saying we're against racism. What they mean is they're against what they saw on that camera because it's on that camera. I don't know yet if you're against racism until you have to vote on a policy.
Ooh.
I really don't know that. Mm-hmm. See, all I know right now is it's too hot for you to be, pro that.
Yeah.
Unless you're Trump or somebody, and
right.
even, he got enough sense to say he didn't go too far. He said he didn't like what he saw. And a lot of people can say, I'm against what happened to George Floyd. But what about putting in the law that if you are an officer and you murder somebody, there will be investigation, prosecution, conviction, and incarceration for what you did.
And if you're an officer that's there when that happens and doesn't prevent that from happening.
Right. And if you are a department and you hire and house people who have these racist elements, and it's found out that you're gonna have to pay, right, the people that they that's when you'll know who's against racism. Right. You can talk all day long, but when we have to vote on this restoration of the Voting Rights Act, because see, every policy denial, we often don't talk about it like this, but in America, you have to examine the racist elements in every policy.
That's right.
It might seem benign, like we can be talking about healthcare, but you can't talk about the denial of healthcare without talking about racial disparity. You can't talk about denial of living wages without talking about racial disparity. And the way we change it, Brother Charlamagne, is we have to have that conversation. Too often in this culture, many people, they want to have the spectacle conversation. Like what's happening now, everybody, you know, we got to change this, we got to change this. Too many people mean we need to put things back in the box and go back to normal. Well, no. Do you remember Dr. King in 1963, his I Have a Dream speech was actually entitled Normalcy No More. That was the actual title. And that's what, we can't have normalcy. We can't be the same coming out of this. We need a thorough examination of all the policies of this land and how they continue to perpetuate systemic racism and systemic poverty.
That's why I keep saying, man, voting doesn't matter if the person you voting for is not going to go in there and help dismantle the system of white supremacy.
Exactly. And then you got to teach folk what we do in the Poor People's Campaign is we teach people that racism, when you really push it, it's not just against Black people, it's against humanity, it's against the democracy. It hurts everybody. Remember what I said, the same politician that passed racist voter suppression law block living wages and block health care. And when they do that, it actually blocks more in raw numbers, not in impact, white people. That's why our campaign is organizing people in the hills of Kentucky and in the Black streets of Louisville. Because Dr. King said in '65, anytime Black poor folk and white poor folk, he said this at the end of the Selma to Montgomery march, I think one of his greatest speeches that we don't reference enough. He said, anytime there's the possibility for poor Black folk and poor white people to change the political capitals and to change the policies, the bourbon class, notice he didn't say Democrat or Republican, he said the bourbon class, the aristocracy, sows division by design. And so we have to, first of all, deal with what racism is. And then second of all, we have to examine it in every aspect of policy. And then third of all, we have to be able to name specific policies that are going to unpack it. And I think what people misread when you ask these questions on the front end, they act like Black people, like if you ask a question and push me, then you might not vote for me in November. Well, I might not. But if I ask you and maybe you give me 50%, I might look at the other person and say, well, they're at 20%, so I vote for you, and then I push you after the election for the rest of the 50. But you can't just get a pass.
I got 2 quick questions, man. The Poor People's Campaign, that's the movement Dr. MLK Jr. was pivoting to. It's ultimately, I think, what got him killed. What made you want to take that cause on?
Well, it got him killed. You know, it pains me to say some of this, but when Dr. King called his nation the greatest purveyor of violence, in exactly 1 year to the date of his death, August 3rd, 1967, and he started talking about the 3 evils: poverty, racism, and militarism. Mm-hmm. And he said that America couldn't be who she pretends to be and promises to be without dealing with all 3 of those, moral fusion. He said we got to deal with all 3 of them. The next morning, over 100 newspapers wrote against him. Some Black newspapers wrote against him. Some Black organizations wrote resolutions against him. Prominent organizations, some ministers turned against him. He lost his invitation to the White House. And the more he started talking about the two Americas, one prosperous and one poor, the more he started bringing together poor and white people and Black people around this agenda to deal with racism and poverty. What you see in the street now, white and Black folk, but talking about racism and poverty. Once he did that, he was marked because it was about fundamentally shifting the society. Now, the other half of that story is it was the Black welfare rights women that kind of pushed Dr. King to go in that direction. And Dr. King understood something. You cannot change this society until you change the narrators. Mm-hmm. That's what we're doing today. On the 20th, you won't hear a lot of people pontificating about the poor. You're going to hear from poor and impacted people using their own agency. We're organizing poor and low-wealth people of every race, creed, and color by the thousands across this country. And they have a story to tell and they have an agenda to demand. right? And they understand, the ones we're organizing, that it requires addressing all these issues, not either one. And Dr. King knew that. He knew that. But a lot of people walked away from it. A lot of his own people walked away from it. Rabbi Heschel stood with him, and Cesar Chavez stood with him, and the welfare rights women stood with him, and some other, but they walked away. Because when you start talking about poverty and racism and militarism, and we believe you add ecological devastation, and then this false white nationalism, white evangelicalism, religious evangelicalism, now you're getting at the heart of the matter. The heart of the matter. And when you start saying, we can't, somebody the other day said to me, I was in a conversation, it's been some time ago, and they were saying, well, Reverend Barber, we're going to get to $10 minimum wage, and then we'll move. And I said, hold on for a second, hold on. It took us 400 years, 250 years of slavery, 100 years of Jim Crow to get to 725. We went from 0 to 725. That slavery 0 to, how much longer? I mean, really, now think about how much longer. And on top of that, how your economy is going down. Right now, if you passed a living wage, it would actually help us stop this possible depression we're going into, because people would have more disposable resources.
Yeah.
Right? So yes, Dr. King started it. Many other people were there. It got him killed, but there has to be a resurrection. And and we see the Poor People's Campaign as part of that resurrection. But we are also reaching back to the first Reconstruction and what we call the moral fusion movement and bringing people together. A lot of people don't know that right after slavery, Black and white people formed coalitions in the South that fundamentally reached the Southern state for about 4 years. And they passed new voting laws, new criminal justice laws, new economic laws, and then it was violently overturned. And then it was really overturned in 1877 when a president loses the popular vote, but wins the electoral college. We heard that before?
Yeah.
That happened in 1877.
Yeah.
And by 1896, we had Plessy versus Ferguson. By 1898, we had the Wilmington riot. By 1900, Black people were being hung and lynched on an average of 1 per day. And then we elected Woodrow Wilson, who played Birth of a Nation in the Oval Office and said it was accurate history, who also during a pandemic denied it and caused 650,000 people to die in the country. See, so we're seeing some of the return, but on the other side, we always had movements of resistance. We've always had people like you, Charlamagne, that say, no, I want to see the policy. I want to know what's going on. I want you to tell me, just like when you go in and speak to these lobbyists and speak to the corporation, we want to know what the policies are and what you're going to fight for. And some of it is, even if you don't win, if we at least know you're not going to just write off 140 million poor people, at least you're going to call their names and create a policy and fight, and then give us something, and we're going to push in the street, and at least you're going to turn our screams into public policy. That's what we need. Turn out, don't let us mourn for nothing, because our mourning, our marching, our protest is proof that we still have some hope in the possibility of change. What we need is folk who will turn those screams and those mourning into public policy, and let's have the debate. Let's stop allowing people to undercut us in the back room and all of these discussions where they say, well, we work it out in the back room. Have the debate in public. Have the debate on C-SPAN. Let us know where people stand on these issues. And if you do that, it will actually cause the democracy to breathe. See, what I think is happening right now, all these protests, people feel like they have the weight of poverty on them, the weight of police brutality on them, the weight of hurt, the weight of this pandemic, the weight of denial of healthcare. And all the protesting, in addition to being for George, is the democracy is trying to breathe.
That's right.
Establishment of justice is trying to breathe. Providing for the common defense is trying to breathe. Promoting the general welfare is trying to breathe. Equal protection under law is trying to breathe. Because what's happening is, metaphorically, the whole culture is saying, we can't breathe. Maybe you can sit in your office and be okay, but I can't feed my children. 140 million of us. I work every day and sleep in my car. I can tell you story after story. I'd like for someone to come on your show. So you're not listening to me, black and white. And people are saying, I can't breathe. But I see the corporations breathing. I see them getting more and more and more and more resources. And you tell me it's going to trickle down, but it never trickles down because it's not going to trickle down. It has to come from the bottom up. I can't breathe, and I'm trying to breathe. The worst, that's why I'm so thankful to see people in the streets. I'm so thankful to see these young people, because let me tell you something. The worst thing that could have happened in the midst of COVID, in the midst of all this death and George dying, would have been for people to see it and say, oh, well.
Mm-hmm.
The worst thing would be for the Breakfast Club to say, yeah, oh, well, I don't care about policy. Because that would mean you had turned to a kind of cynicism. And I said that the mourning is the hope. The hope is inside the mourning. The hope is inside the protest. Because the worst thing it would be just not to give a so-and-so.
Absolutely.
My last question, man, because you are a reverend. I feel like everything that's going on right now is divine, and I truly feel like no good is going to come to America until they do right by Black people through legislation and reparations. What do you think?
Exactly. You cannot, John Hope Franklin said something that capsulated it for me, and I'm going to repeat him. God bless him. He's gone on now. We did an interview with him. He was one of my professors, John Hope Franklin, C. Eric Lincoln, and Early Thorpe. They were three of the great historians, Black historians. I call them activist historians. And one day we were talking about reparations. This is how John Hope Franklin said it. He said, if I could keep somebody in slavery for 250 years and then let them go and just say, oops, that's what not doing reparations. That's not dealing with the realities of the injustices that still permeate from 250 years of free labor being taken. If I can do that to somebody and then just say, well, DJ Envy, oops, I'm sorry. Go be free. That's what John Hope Franklin said. America can't just say oops.
Right.
Not just to us, but to the genocide, because that's toward First Nation people. You can't just say oops. Mm-hmm. You can't build an entire country on the backs of slavery that was rooted in what we call bad biology, and that is your skin color determines your brain size. 6, sociology, that is Black and white people can't be together on the same level, at the same level of humanity. Evil economics, that the end justifies the mean no matter what you do. Just as long as somebody makes money, it's all right. And then the last one is heretical ontology. That is that God meant for it to be like that. You can't build an entire economic system in a country on top of that, and then at the end of it, and the end of the Jim Crow, legal Jim Crow, say oops, when you still are trapped in so many ways by systemic racism. Can't do that. And it doesn't even make sense to do that. We don't do it to anybody else. Again, going back to the corporation. When the corporations heard the pandemic was coming, they said, you better pay us. They used something called the shock doctrine. They said, it's coming and you better pay us. Now, we're already bloated. We're already refusing to pay our people health care. We're already refusing to pay living wages. But you better pay us. Right? That's what the corporation said. And guess what the country said? Okay. Here's $1.5 trillion. We're not even going to go to Congress with this. The Treasury Department just going to give you this. Okay, we'll pay you. Then we're going to cut out another $2 trillion. Okay, here it is. So it doesn't even make sense for people not to have that conversation, and not only conversation from a policy standpoint, deal with the issue of reparation. And one of the best persons to deal with is Dr. Sandy Darrett, a good friend of mine at Duke. He's just written a new book on it, as a matter of fact.
Oh, I want him on the show, man. Tell Sandy I want to get him on.
Yeah, we're good friends. I used to teach over at Duke. But let me just say this closing thing. That's why I wrote that book. I'm not pushing my book, but the title. Inside that book, if I could, since I am a preacher, there's a scripture in the Bible in Ezekiel. It's a very political scripture because all of the scripture is really political. You know, the number one sin in the Bible is idolatry. The number two is mistreatment of the poor and the immigrant and stranger. That's number two. There are over 2,000 scriptures in the Bible that castigate any nation that hurts the poor and the least of these. One of them is in Ezekiel 22, where it says, in the message about your politicians have become like wolves, devouring the people. And your preachers cover up for them. And because they cover up for them, extortion is rife, poverty and injustice is epidemic. Then it says, I looked for someone to stand in the gap so that I would not have to destroy the nation, and I could not find anybody. That's Ezekiel 22. Then over in Ezekiel 37, God tells the prophet, he says, go down to the valley. I want you to go among all the people that have been hurt by these wolf-like politicians. I want you to go down to all that. That's where the power is. Now they look like they can't get up. But if you take a plan down there, if you go down there and preach, I'm doing it metaphorically. If you go down there and preach, and then Ezekiel said, but I don't know if these folk can live. They've been beat up so long. God said, don't you worry about that. You just put the plan out there. You go preach. You go talk to them. Let me deal with raising them up. And the folk in the valley, the stones that have been cast away, the people, they become the movement. And that's what I was talking about. Politicians will be only as good as we make them. Our political system will be only as good as we make them. And so that's why we can't even wait on them to have an agenda. We have to have an agenda and then demand that agenda be responded to. And that's what the Poor People's Campaign done. We don't just talk about the numbers and the problem. For every problem we raise, we have a solution. You can go to www.poorpeoplescampaign.org, and it's right there, your listeners. And you can join us on June 20th, 2020 to hear it. 10 o'clock on every kind of social media. On the MSNBC is going to do a big piece on it, and let us use their entire social media platform. We want people to tune in to hear white people talking about racism, black people talking about economic issues, and telling their story and saying, we are not going to quit until all five: systemic racism, systemic poverty, ecological devastation, denial of health care, this war economy, and the false moral narrative, religious nationalism are addressed. These things have to be addressed. And if you are bothered by what we do, remember that when a man is bleeding, ambulances run the light. And it's normal for an ambulance to run the light when folk are in trouble. Dr. King said that. He said, and we need some ambulance drivers now. Some people who are willing to refuse to obey the rules of it's all right, it's okay, just wait and wait again. Too many people are dying. Too many people are suffering. We must make our political system respond. We must do it in our deepest moral and nonviolent, I believe, traditions, but it must not be weak. It has to be strong, has to be agenda-based. It has to last for an election and beyond an election.
My brother, thank you, man. Appreciate you, Reverend Barber.
Thank you for even having me, Doc.
Yes, sir. Don't be a stranger.
I won't. Now, next time, though, I'm a little mad because y'all didn't drop no music. I guess you don't do it when you taping, see, and I won't get out here because, like, I am a preacher, but I can still get down. You don't trust the prophet that can't dance.
What you want to hear? Envy, play him a song. What you want to hear, Rap?
Let me see. What I want to hear. What I want to hear today. Fight the powers that be.
Fight the powers.
All right. Done deal.
That take me way back. Fight the
deal.
powers that be. All right.
My brother.
God bless you. Take care.
You too.
Breakfast Club, good morning.